Since the very beginning of League of Legends, new champions have been created with very unique and interesting designs. We have a tiny hamster-looking thing running around spitting darts and throwing explosive mushrooms, an eldritch evil spirit that looks like something you would see from a Final Fantasy or Kingdom Hearts game, and a galaxy-sized monster who literally eats planets all in the same game. And while there's been some debate about the direction of new champions all looking humanoid with typically very attractive physical appearances relative to their circumstances, I don't think anyone would disagree with the claim that League of Legends has a very sundry roster of champions. But amidst many of the ones that become household names in the community, there's a few that fall under scrutiny for one reason or another, most of the time in a negative way. Whether it would be due to their design or lack of popularity, something about them just doesn't click or resonate with players, and so today, I want to delve into the failed champions of League of Legends. I probably should make a disclaimer to prevent any misunderstandings. I don't think there's ever such a thing as a total failure of a champion, unless you count Old Yorick. Based on the title of the video and the thumbnail, I'm sure many of you can infer what I mean when I say fail. It's mathematically impossible for all champions to be successful given there's only 10 champions that can be picked in a game out of well over 150. But for certain ones, you usually notice a trend of behavior from Riot and sometimes the players, causing them to be abandoned and or forgotten. In my Why No One Plays series, there's always comments deducing that many of the episodes share similar things. No one plays Nasus for the same reasons as Kayle, or no one plays Victor for the same reasons as Ryze. This video is meant to tackle those similarities and look for common pitfalls between them by comparing the differences between champions that succeeded versus those who didn't. So to clarify one more time, this is just a case study of sorts, not a declaration of what champions are objectively good or bad, since we all have different opinions for what constitutes a well-designed champion. The two things I want to prioritize are their statistical performance, such as their pick and ban and win rate over the years, along with their overall history, noting any meaningful updates to them since release that drove them to the state they're in, or if the root problem is their original champion concept. Probably should mention I want to talk more about recent examples, so any champion released after Season 5 when Riot became more ambitious with their ideas. One other thing, I'm intentionally leaving out reworks because I want to save those for the retrospective series. I had half a mind to bring up Yorick and Taric in this video, but probably best to just save them for their own. If we go by overall popularity, I'd argue they're not doing half bad. A lot of new additions like Viego, Samira, Yone, Sett, Senna, Qiyana, Yuumi, Sylas, Pyke, Kai'Sa, Kayn, and so on have found lasting interest among players. More often than not, whatever they make does a good job in terms of marketability. That being said, it's not all of them. Between Seasons 5 and 6, Tahm Kench, Illaoi, Kled, Aurelion Sol, and Ivern were released within the span of 8 champions, none of whom have been able to so much as break into mid-level popularity. More recently was the inclusion of Rell and Lilia, who out of the past 10 champions had noticeably lower statistical results even during their maiden voyages. It's normal for champions to have very high pick rates during their initial launch through just their novelty, and they frequently go up as high as 20%. The other 8 champions, Akshan, Gwen, Viego, Seraphine, Samira, Yone, Sett, and Aphelios had no trouble breaking that number. Some of them even managed to stay in the double digits long after their initial hype died down, and all of them have radically different playstyles too. Based on this, we can't pinpoint champion success or failure on specific designs for the new ones, as all of them have very impactful gameplay with equal parts carry potential and fun experience, but we can for the ones before. Let's go back to Aurelion Sol for the moment, widely believed to be Riot's most spectacular failure of a champion. He has an incredible design, to this day, one of the most unique champions I've ever seen, a very intriguing playstyle too thanks to his passive stars being the main source of damage, not him. Regarding damage, he's got some of the best DPS uptime out of any battle mage, which is high praise given the subclass excelling at consistent damage output. His ability to cover large distances is quite desirable for a mid laner, seeing as they have quick access to anywhere on the map, and his area control can be a menace in teamfights and the neutral game. With these factors in mind, it wouldn't be unreasonable to expect him to be at the very least a solid counter pick or pocket pick, right? Of course, anyone who's tried to play Ace Sol themselves would know the reason for his unpopularity lies in his unwieldy nature. Since his 3 stars are always a fixed distance away from him, he's the only champion in the game with a melee dead zone, which is extremely counterintuitive on a class that's effectively the magic damage equivalent to Juggernauts. Other short-range mages like Rumble, Karthus, Swain, and Vladimir actively try to get as close to their opponents as possible for maximum pressure. And even the ones who want to keep some distance have very easy ways to hold their opponents in place, like Ryze's point-and-click route or Talia's Unraveled Earth. Cassiopeia's Miasma used to have a minimum cast range, making it so melee champions could overwhelm her by staying on top of her. But ever since it was removed in patch 9.14, Miasma has become the single most overpowered counter to mobility-dependent champions. But One could argue it was a necessary change for her to go toe-to-toe with fighters and slayers. Despite being a very fluid and surprisingly fast-moving mage, he's so clunky to play because even if you were good at spacing against your opponent, they would only take damage if they were hit directly by his stars, and there's only 3 of them. It would be one thing if his ring of stars covered an entire circle. After all, other spacing moves like Darius Q don't care where you are in the sweet spot as long as you're in it. But the fact that you can aim your attacks perfectly, but they still won't take damage because they're standing in the gaps between stars causes more frustration than enjoyment. In other words, Aurelion Sol's source of failure was and still is his unforgiving and honestly terrible user experience. To many of us, playing him would be like playing with a tennis racket that has holes in it big enough for the ball to slip right through. While he's an extreme case, it establishes the first litmus test that would lead to a champion being discarded by the community. It doesn't matter how strong the champion can be if they're frustrating or uncomfortable to handle. Fortunately, there aren't that many who share this problem. In fact, the only other 2 I can think of would be Illaoi and Kled. Even though juggernauts are meant to be slow and immobile, Illaoi's circumstantial nature can lead to situations where if you were playing any other juggernaut, you probably might have won. A common thing shared between her and Sol is their dependence on external, uncontrollable sources of damage, at least not freely controllable on demand wherever you want to put them. Neither of them have received all that many buffs or nerfs, and while they both got a small adjustment to their abilities, they play very much the same way as when they first came out half a decade ago. It's just the way they play doesn't feel very good to the average player. That's what separates them from the likes of Azir and Orianna, who both feel really nice to play since they have direct control over that source of damage. As for Kled, the lack of control comes from when he dismounts. The only thing determining that is if his health falls below a certain threshold, and of course, his violent tendencies, which immediately activates when off cooldown. One might compare his involuntary dismount to Gnar's involuntary transformation, but to an extent it's a lot easier to manage Gnar's rage than Kled since Gnar doesn't gain rage unless he attacks or is in combat, whereas you can't really ask the enemy team to stop attacking you when playing Kled. I should also mention that unlike Gnar, who has 2 separate playstyles each strong in their own right, dismounted Kled is barely half a character, and the only thing he can really do is smack away at an enemy champion to get Skarl back as quickly as possible. More of a handicap than a second skin if you really think about it. Speaking of lack of control over something you greatly depend on, the category hosting the most amount of champion failures would be team-dependent champions. While the game's premise is about 5 players working together to achieve victory, most champions are inherently self-sufficient. Any synergy they have with other champions is pure secondary coincidence. A good example of this would be Yasuo. His last breath can only be used on displaced targets, and though he would be more than happy to have a Malphite or a Zac on his team, it's not necessary for him to do the things that he can. He has his own knockups through Steel Tempest. The same can't be said for everyone though. Both Rel and Lilia demonstrate this. Contrary to Aurelion Sol, these 2 actually have pretty comfortable playstyles, fun even. Rel's one of the more interesting tank designs I've seen since she has 2 different stances and her CC combo potential can supply enough lockdown for her team by herself. Lilia and Hecarim are quite similar in that they both have wide sweeping Qs and revolve around movement speed for most of their gameplay. However, Hecarim is about head-on confrontation, whereas Lilia plays more like a hit and run. Why Rel and Lilia didn't see that much success is one word: teammates. Both champions have far more presence in pro play than they do solo queue because they bring some of the strongest teamfight engage I've seen from a skirmisher jungler and tank support respectively. Rel's combination of engage, while potent, requires her teammates to know exactly when she's gonna go in, as her lockdown can hit many targets at the same time, but not for very long. Attract and Repel not only needs a tethered ally to be within range, but it's only a half-second stun. She doesn't have the same kind of 50-year CC chain the way Nautilus and Leona do, nor does she have the same damage as them. As for Lilia, her ultimate is a massive sleep on any champion that is affected by her passive, which can potentially hit all 5 members of the enemy team. Problem is, unlike Zoe whose paddle star hits like a truck, Lilia doesn't have an ability that can reliably nuke the entire enemy team on her own, so she usually depends on her teammates to bring in the wombo combo for maximum effect. Champions that depend on their team for a significant portion of their gameplay are inherently prone to fail in solo queue because that would indicate they're missing something in their kit that needs to be supplemented externally, and that won't be available to you all the time. In case you're wondering why this doesn't apply to all support champions, it's because the engaged supports like Pyke and Rakan can do their job regardless of situation, Yuumi becomes untargetable, and champions like Senna and Seraphine are both self-sufficient. They don't need an AD carry. The last category does have good usability and can take care of themselves, but don't do enough of their job to make a difference. That's where Nico, Tahm Kench, Taliyah, and Xayah fall under. Unlike the second group, there's nothing in their kit that's completely absent. Tahm Kench, even pre-rework, had everything he needed to be a complete champion, which is why he was able to go top lane. Nico's Tangle Barbs, at least the empowered one, lasts long enough for her to follow up with Pop Blossom, and despite technically being designed around her synergy with Rakan, Xayah doesn't need her man for anything, she can do everything by herself. Taliyah as well. She can force enemies to trigger Unraveled Earth even if they don't have a dash thanks to her Seismic Shove, and her Threaded Volley is a very serviceable damaging tool. But having made a why no one plays on all 4 of them, the commonality between them is that whatever they do doesn't go above and beyond the Call of Duty, which is kinda sad because I'm essentially saying they're failures because they're balanced. Sure, each of them have moments where they shine, but not bright enough to where players would consider picking them over any other champion in the game. A simple solution to that would be to just buff their numbers, right? Not exactly. If a champion has a moderate or high play rate only when they're overtuned, that's a sign people only play them because, well, they're overtuned. That's what happened to Taliyah at the start of this season, and that's what's happening to Tahm Kench after he got reworked. Don't get me wrong, high statistical performance does play a part in the loyalty of a champion's player base. A good number of people play Lee Sin because he's one of the best early game junglers even when he's weak, but it shouldn't swing so far in one direction or the other. So those are the 3 main causalities behind champions failing in League of Legends. They either feel really awkward or uncomfortable to play, they place too much dependence on outside sources, namely their teammates, just to do their main job, or they just don't do quite enough, and can only really be viable when they're overbuffed. I only went through champions that came out after Season 5, but you honestly can fit older champions into one of these 3 categories too. Now, just like how in Bell's Nightmares I talked about how it's unclear as to whether or not it's the champion's fault or the community's, that applies even more so in this one. I know what some of you are thinking, people don't play Tahm Kench because he's a fat catfish, or people don't play Aurelion Sol because he's not an edgy anime swordsman. Look, as much as I know recent champions all look like hot chiseled anime characters, I seriously doubt that it actually matters because there are some very, very attractive champions with low pick rates. Pantheon is the chaddest Chad who ever chatted, and he doesn't get that much action nowadays, but I digress. Common perception towards successful champions has certainly shifted in the past few years, and it's reflected in the rise of what we expect in newer champions. At the time, Aurelion Sol was one of the coolest things we've ever seen. He had the most unique kit out of any champion that came before him, but if we were to release him now after seeing Akshan, Viego, and Aphelios, he wouldn't be all that crazy, so we can't disregard the passage of time having a key influence on certain champions, failing in air quotes. All the same, there's the possibility that the few who do play those champions think otherwise. Maybe Nico One-Tricks love her the way she is, or Lilia players think she has everything she needs and I'm just spitting garbage out of my mouth. Who knows? Anyway, that's going to be it for today. Let me know your thoughts on failed champions in the comments down below. Again, not a personal attack to anyone's main, just looking back at how things went for the ones who never really became mainstream past their initial hype. But if you enjoyed today's video, it would be awesome if you could leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to follow me on my socials and join my Discord server if you haven't yet. Also, check out my other videos after this one, I have a ton of discussion topics that might interest you. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.